There was no warning posted on the city wall, no announcement read aloud in the marketplace, no scroll distributed through the streets of Jerusalem explaining what was coming, what it would cost, or what would happen to those who refused. The system simply arrived, carved into stone, pressed into clay, stamped onto coins, and the people of first-century Judea found themselves inside it before they ever had a chance to understand it. We think of the mark of the beast as a future event, something sealed in prophecy, distant and technological, belonging to a world of microchips and surveillance networks. And yet, when the Apostle John reached for language to describe the most suffocating form of economic and spiritual control imaginable, he reached for something his readers already knew, something they had already lived through, something their grandparents had whispered about in fear and their children had grown up accepting as the ordinary texture of daily life. To understand what John was describing in the book of Revelation, you have to stand inside the first century. You have to feel the weight of a Roman denarius in your palm, read the face pressed into its silver surface, and understand what it meant to carry that image in your pocket, and what it meant if you couldn't. If you've ever wondered why the early followers of Jesus were so shaken by these visions of marks and numbers and buying and selling, stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand what Jesus was asking of the people who chose to follow him. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you've been looking for, the kind that makes the Bible feel real and alive, consider joining this channel. There's much more of this waiting for you. The Roman Empire did not conquer through armies alone. It conquered through systems, through roads and census records and tax collectors and grain distribution networks. It conquered through the very structure of commerce itself, through the insistence that in order to buy, sell, trade, or participate in civic life, a person had to operate within a framework that Rome controlled completely. In the Galilee of Jesus' time, this framework was not abstract. It was the smell of the marketplace in the morning, the sound of coins being counted at the gate, the sight of Roman soldiers standing at checkpoints where merchants entered with their goods and left with receipts. It was the texture of daily existence, so ordinary, so pervasive, that most people never stopped to name it as control. It simply was the world. The market in Capernaum opened at sunrise. Fishing families who had worked through the night would bring their catch to the docks while the sky was still pale and gray, laying out their baskets on stone tables worn smooth by decades of use. Farmers arrived from the hills above the lake with donkeys loaded with grain, figs, and olives. Weavers carried rolled cloth on their shoulders. Potters wheeled carts of amphorae through the narrow lanes, their cargo knocking softly together in the early quiet. And at every point of exchange, at every transaction, every toll gate, every moment when goods changed hands, there was a Roman system waiting to measure, record, and extract. The Roman taxation structure in first-century Judea operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and it was designed with a clarity of purpose that would be recognizable to anyone who has ever felt trapped inside a bureaucratic machine. There was the tributum soli, a land tax, the tributum capitis, a head tax on every adult, customs duties at ports and road stations, market taxes, taxes on fishing rights in the Lake of Galilee, which meant that men like Simon Peter and Andrew were not simply fishermen operating freely. They were working within a licensed system, paying for the right to cast their nets in water their fathers had fished for generations without permission. The tax collectors, the Teleni, were not Roman soldiers. They were local men, Jewish men, men who had purchased the right to collect taxes from Rome itself, paying up front for a regional contract and then recovering their investment by extracting as much as the population could bear, keeping the excess as their own profit. The system was designed to create extraction. It was designed to turn neighbor against neighbor, to make collaboration with Rome economically rational and moral resistance economically catastrophic. This is the world that Zacchaeus came from, the world that Matthew, Levi, came from when he sat at his tax booth in Capernaum and Jesus walked past and said, simply, "Follow me." The weight of that invitation cannot be understood without understanding what Matthew was being asked to leave behind. Not just a profession, a position inside the system, a layer of protection, a means of survival in a world where the alternative to participation was exclusion, and exclusion meant hunger. Because that is what the system ultimately enforced. The threat of being cut off. Not cut off from luxury. Cut off from bread. Cut off from the ability to feed your children, to pay your debts, to remain inside the social fabric of your community. The economic and the social were inseparable in the ancient world. To be excluded from the market was to be excluded from belonging itself. This is the world in which John of Patmos, writing decades after the crucifixion, reached for the image that would haunt Christian imagination for 2,000 years, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. His readers did not need this explained. They were living inside a version of it already. They understood, in their bodies, what it meant to have your ability to participate in economic life dependent on your willingness to submit to a power that demanded not just your labor, but your allegiance, your identity, pressed like a coin into the image of something that was not God. The question was not whether the system existed. The question was what you did when you were inside it, and what it cost to resist. To understand how deeply the Roman imperial system reached into the lives of ordinary people in first-century Judea, you have to begin with something as small as a coin. Not the coin as an abstract symbol. The coin as a physical object, the weight of it, the image pressed into its face, the theological statement it made simply by existing in your hand. The standard Roman denarius of the first century bore the image of the reigning emperor on its obverse side. Under Tiberius, who ruled throughout the entire public ministry of Jesus, the coin carried his profile with a laurel wreath and an inscription that read, in Latin, Ti Caesar Divi AVG F AVG Vis TVS, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, Augustus. On the reverse, a seated female figure, likely representing Livia as the embodiment of peace, with the inscription Pontiff Maxim, High Priest. Every single commercial transaction in the Roman economy passed through this object. Every loaf of bread purchased in the market, every basket of fish, every length of cloth, every payment of rent to a landlord, every settlement of debt, every wage paid to a laborer at the end of a long day in someone else's field. The coin was not neutral. It was a declaration. It announced in metal and image that the emperor was divine, that his authority was sacred, and that the economy you were participating in was his economy, operating under his blessing and his dominion. For a devout Jewish person in first-century Galilee or Judea, this was not simply an inconvenience. It was a daily, inescapable confrontation with idolatry. The Torah was explicit: no graven images, no other gods, no acknowledgement of divine authority belonging to anyone other than the God of Israel. And yet, here was the divine emperor's face, required for every transaction, impossible to avoid, pressed into the most ordinary moments of daily survival. The Pharisees understood this tension with extraordinary precision, which is exactly why the question they brought to Jesus in the temple was not a simple political trap. It was a genuine theological crisis dressed as a test. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? The question was constructed to destroy him regardless of his answer. If he said yes, pay the tax, he would appear to endorse the idolatrous imperial system and lose the trust of the people who were suffering under it. If he said no, refuse the tax, he would give Roman authorities grounds to arrest him for sedition immediately. It was a perfect vice, the kind that only works when the person being questioned has nowhere to move. Except that Jesus moved. Show me the tribute money. Someone produced a denarius, and in that single gesture, in the act of someone reaching into their robe and pulling out a coin bearing the emperor's divine image, the entire structure of the confrontation shifted. Jesus had not asked for the coin. Someone else produced it. Someone who was already carrying it. Someone who was already inside the system, already bearing the emperor's image on their person, already participating in the economy that coin represented. Whose image and inscription is this? Caesar's. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. 2,000 years of theological interpretation have circled this answer, but the people standing in the temple that day would have heard something immediate and visceral. The coin belongs to Caesar. It bears his image. But you bear the image of God. You were made in the image of God, not the image of an emperor. And what you owe to God cannot be paid in Caesar's currency. This was not an abstract theological point. It was a direct confrontation with the deepest anxiety of Jewish life under Roman occupation. The question of what you were when the system demanded that you become something else in order to survive. The Roman imperial cult was not limited to coins. It permeated the architecture of every city in the empire. The temples of the imperial cult, dedicated to the divine emperor and his family, were the most prominent buildings in most major urban centers. In Caesarea Maritima, the city Herod the Great built on the Mediterranean coast as a monument to Roman collaboration. A massive temple to Augustus dominated the harbor, visible to every ship entering the port. In Caesarea Philippi, at the foot of Mount Hermon, the sanctuary of Pan sat alongside dedications to Augustus, carved directly into the rock face. Herod had built temples to the divine emperor throughout his territory. This is the geography of the world in which Jesus taught. When Jesus took his disciples north to Caesarea Philippi, to the precise location where Roman imperial divinity was literally carved into the rock, and asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" the question was not asked in a neutral space. It was asked in the shadow of the emperor's divine claims, at the base of a cliff covered in dedications to gods and rulers who demanded worship and obedience. And Peter's answer, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," was not simply a doctrinal statement. It was a direct counter-declaration made in the most charged location imaginable. Not the son of the divine Augustus, not the heir of Caesar's sacred authority. The Son of the living God, the one whose image was not pressed into silver, but breathed into the dust from which human beings were made. The imperial system did not only demand worship in temples and on coins, it demanded participation through the trade guilds. In the cities of the Roman Empire, and this becomes critically important when reading the letters of Paul and the visions of John, the professional guilds were the backbone of urban economic life. Bakers belonged to a guild. Metalworkers belonged to a guild. Tanners, weavers, silversmiths, potters. Every trade had its organized professional association, and membership in these guilds was not optional if you wanted to practice your trade legally and maintain access to the market. The guilds held regular communal meals. They maintained shrines to their patron deities. They participated in the festivals of the imperial cult as organized professional bodies. To be a member in good standing, to have the right to work, to sell, to belong, you were expected to participate in these religious observances, not necessarily with deep personal conviction, but with your presence, with your portion of the sacrificial meal, with your acknowledgement, however formal, that the gods of Rome and the divine emperor presided over the commercial world you inhabited. For Jewish communities, exemptions existed, imperfectly, inconsistently, dependent on local conditions and the goodwill of particular administrators. For the early followers of Jesus, who were increasingly understood as distinct from the Jewish community, those exemptions were evaporating. And for converts from paganism, who had joined the early church in cities like Ephesus, Thyatira, Pergamum, and Smyrna, the cities John addresses directly in the opening of Revelation, the pressure was immediate and economic. Refuse to participate in the guild meals, in the imperial cult festivals, in the ritual acknowledgement of gods whose existence you now denied, and you lost your livelihood. You lost your place in the market. You lost your ability to buy and sell. John's readers in those 7 cities did not read Revelation as distant prophecy. They read it as a description of their present moment, pressed into apocalyptic language because the present moment required that kind of scale to be properly named. In the city of Thyatira, in the mid-1st century, a woman named Lydia sold purple cloth. We know her name because Luke recorded it in the book of Acts. A merchant, a dealer in luxury textiles, a woman of sufficient means and independence to maintain a household and extend hospitality to Paul and his companions during their time in Philippi. But her trade connected her to a city whose entire economic identity was built around the dyeing and weaving industry, and that industry was threaded through with the religious obligations of the guild system in ways that made every bolt of cloth she sold a small negotiation between commerce and conscience. Purple dye in the ancient world was not a simple product. It was extracted from the murex sea snail along the Phoenician coast, or produced through madder root processing in inland cities like Thyatira, and its production required specialized knowledge, significant capital investment, and organized labor operating under guild structures that had existed for generations. The Guild of Dyers in Thyatira was not merely a professional association, it was a social institution with religious dimensions, regular sacrificial meals, festivals honoring the patron deity of the craft, public ceremonies in which members demonstrated their belonging to the professional community, and, by extension, to the broader civic and imperial order. To sell purple cloth legally, reliably, with access to the best markets and the protection of established commercial relationships, you operated within this system. And this is the tension that crackles underneath the letter to the church at Thyatira in Revelation chapter 2, where John, writing in the name of the risen Christ, condemns a figure he calls Jezebel, a teacher who was apparently instructing the believers there that it was acceptable to eat food, sacrifice to idols, and to participate in practices that the letter treats as spiritual compromise. The debate was not abstract. It was about whether Christians in Thyatira could continue to participate in their guild meals, in the civic religious festivals, in the commercial and social rituals that defined membership in the economic life of the city. Some said yes. Participation was necessary for survival. The idols were nothing. Paul himself had written as much. Eating meat that had passed through a temple ceremony did not make the meat spiritually contaminated. Attendance at a guild dinner was not genuine worship. It was professional obligation. It was how you kept your shop open, your family fed, your place in the community intact. Others said no. The line between participation and compromise was real, and crossing it meant something. not because the idol had power, but because the act of conformity itself was a form of declaration. It announced who you belonged to. It pressed the emperor's image, metaphorically speaking, onto the surface of your daily life. This argument was not settled easily. It was not settled cleanly. And the stakes were not theoretical. To refuse the guild system in a Roman city was to accept a specific and concrete set of consequences. And they descended in a sequence that felt, to those experiencing it, like a slow erasure. First came the loss of professional standing. Without guild membership in good standing, a craftsman or merchant lost access to the organized market networks that connected producers to buyers. They could still sell, but informally, at the margins, without the legal protections and commercial relationships that made trade stable and predictable. Prices became harder to negotiate. Buyers became harder to trust. The ordinary security of commerce, the knowledge that your transactions were embedded in a recognized social structure, disappeared. Then came the social consequences. In the ancient city, professional identity and social identity were inseparable. Your guild was your community. Your fellow guild members were the people who attended your children's weddings, who helped when illness struck your household, who provided the kind of mutual support network that made life in a dense urban environment survivable. To lose your guild standing was to lose a layer of social belonging that could not easily be replaced. Then came the economic pressure that accumulated over time. The difficulty of maintaining a workshop without reliable supply chains, without access to the communal facilities that guilds often maintained, without the credit relationships that depended on recognized standing in the commercial community. Debt was always close in the ancient world. Without the protective structures of the guild system, debt became a faster threat. And underneath all of this, always, was the possibility of denunciation. Roman society ran partly on the formal accusation, the delatio, by which a citizen could bring a charge against another before local authorities. Christians who refused participation in imperial cult observances were vulnerable to being denounced as atheists, as antisocial, as enemies of the civic order. The charge of atheism in the Roman world did not mean what it means today. It meant the refusal to honor the gods whose goodwill maintained the city, protected the harvests, kept the armies victorious, held the social fabric together. To refuse the gods was to threaten everyone. This is the atmosphere of low, constant pressure in which the earliest communities of Jesus' followers in the Roman Empire lived. Not the dramatic, sudden persecution of the arena, though that came too, for some, at certain times, but the daily, grinding pressure of a system that made participation the price of survival and defined exclusion as the consequence of refusal. When John wrote that no one would be able to buy or sell without the mark of the beast, he was not constructing a metaphor from nothing. He was naming, in the heightened language of apocalyptic vision, a structure his readers already inhabited. The mark, the charagma in Greek, was a word with specific commercial resonance in the ancient world. It referred to the imperial stamp, the official mark pressed onto documents and goods to certify their legitimacy within the Roman commercial system. To have the mark was to be recognized by the system. To lack it was to exist outside the boundaries of legitimate economic participation. The number 666, which John associates with the beast, has generated centuries of speculation, but its most historically grounded interpretation connects it to the practice of gematria, the assignment of numerical values to letters, and to the name of the Emperor Nero, whose persecution of Christians in Rome had already established a template of state violence against the community. But the deeper resonance of the number was not primarily in its decoding. It was in what it represented. The human system straining toward divine authority and falling short over and over again, always arriving at something less than completeness, always falling one short of 7, the number of divine perfection. 666. Almost. Never enough. A system that claimed divine authority, but could not actually deliver what only God could give. The villages of Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his ministry, operated at a different scale than the imperial cities of Asia Minor. But the pressure of the Roman economic system was not absent. It was simply expressed differently, in the accumulated weight of taxation, debt, land loss, and the slow transformation of subsistence farming communities into dependent labor pools serving the large estates of absentee landlords. The scholar who has studied this landscape most carefully describes a Galilee in the time of Jesus where perhaps a third of agricultural families were operating at or near subsistence level, where a single bad harvest, a sudden illness, an unexpected tax demand could tip a family from tenancy into debt bondage, from debt bondage into day labor, from day labor into the kind of desperate precarity that made the parables of Jesus not illustrations, but mirrors. The prodigal son who goes to feed pigs in a foreign land is not a character study in spiritual rebellion. He is the portrait of what economic collapse looked like. The Galilean farmer's son, who has lost everything and ended up at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, doing work that was ritually defiling, feeding animals that were unclean, in a country where no one knew him and no one owed him anything. When he comes to himself and returns home, what he is returning to is not simply a father's embrace. He is returning to a social network, a land claim, a place inside a community that could sustain life. The father running down the road to meet him is not merely an image of emotional reunion. It is the reinstatement of belonging, the restoration of a person to the economic and social fabric from which exclusion meant slow destruction. Jesus told this story to people who understood exactly what was at stake, because some of them were living it. There is a moment in the Gospel of Mark that passes quickly if you are not paying attention. Jesus is sitting in the temple in Jerusalem, watching the flow of people moving through the court of the women toward the treasury, the 13 trumpet-shaped collection receptacles that line the wall, each designated for a specific type of offering. The wealthy come and deposit large amounts, the coins ringing against the metal in the way that large donations ring, audible and visible, carrying their own social announcement. And then a widow comes, and she drops in 2 lepta, the smallest coins in circulation in first-century Judea, each worth approximately 1/64th of a denarius, together worth less than a single hour of a laborer's daily wage. Jesus calls his disciples together and says, "This poor widow has put in more than all the others." We read this as a lesson in generosity, and it is. But there is a layer beneath the generosity that the historical context makes visible. A layer of profound and unsettling structural observation that the disciples, sitting in the shadow of the temple in Jerusalem, would have felt in their stomachs. The temple in Jerusalem was not only a sacred space, it was an economic institution of enormous power. Its treasury held vast reserves. Its operation employed thousands, priests, Levites, scribes, money changers, animal traders, craftsmen, administrators. Its annual half-shekel tax was collected from Jewish communities across the entire diaspora, from Rome to Babylon, from Alexandria to Antioch. The temple was the financial center of Jewish life in a way that had no modern equivalent because there was no separation between the religious and the economic in the ancient world. And the widow who dropped in her 2 lepta was not making a free and joyful contribution from abundance. She was dropping in everything she had to live on. The Greek word bios means not money, but life itself, livelihood, the material substance of existence. She was giving the last of what kept her alive into a treasury that already held more than it could count. Jesus does not celebrate this. He observes it. And immediately after, in the very next passage in Mark's Gospel, without interruption, he looks at the magnificent stones of the temple and says, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down." The sequence is not accidental. The widow and the temple, the extracted life and the institution that extracted it, the system and its cost. This is the world in which the fear of the mark of the beast was not a future anxiety, but a present one, a fear with texture and smell and the specific weight of a coin in a sweating palm. The communities that John was writing to in the book of Revelation were not reading his visions as science fiction. They were reading them as the truest possible description of what they were already experiencing. A system that demanded conformity as the price of survival, that pressed its image onto every transaction, that made the ordinary acts of feeding your family into a daily negotiation with powers that claimed divine authority. The genius of John's apocalyptic language was that it gave this ordinary, grinding, daily pressure its true proportions. It named the empire not as a neutral administrative structure, but as a beast. Something with appetite, something that consumed, something that was ultimately destructible despite its apparent permanence and overwhelming power. The imperial system that felt as eternal and immovable as the carved stone temples of Rome and Caesarea was, in the language of Revelation, a thing with a numbered name and a limited time. This was not political commentary dressed in religious language. It was theological insistence that the system which demanded worship, which made buying and selling contingent on acknowledgement of its divine authority, was making a claim it could not ultimately sustain. The beast could mark its followers. It could control the market. It could make exclusion the punishment for refusal. But it could not deliver what it promised. It could not give life. It could only threaten its removal. The early followers of Jesus in Ephesus and Smyrna and Thyatira and Philadelphia knew this distinction not as doctrine, but as daily experience. They knew what it meant to lose their place in the guild. They knew what it felt like to watch the workshop grow quieter, the orders fewer, the debt closer. They knew the specific social texture of being the household on the street that did not participate in the neighborhood festival, that did not hang garlands on the door during the imperial celebrations, that did not send children to the communal meal where the patron deity was honored. They knew the particular loneliness of that kind of exclusion, not dramatic martyrdom, but the slow, wearing pressure of being structurally outside. And they read John's visions and recognized themselves. The woman clothed with the sun, the beast rising from the sea, the number of the beast pressed onto foreheads and right hands, the forehead being the seat of identity, the right hand being the instrument of work and commerce. The vision was mapping the exact pressure points of their daily lives onto a cosmic canvas and saying, "This is real. What you are experiencing is real, and it will not last forever." The right hand and the forehead are not arbitrary. In the Jewish tradition that formed the imaginative world of both John and his readers, these were precisely the locations designated for the tefillin, the phylacteries worn during prayer, small leather boxes containing passages from the Torah, bound onto the forehead and the left arm, close to the heart. The mark of God's covenant was worn on the body as a declaration of identity and allegiance. John's image of the beast's mark on the forehead and right hand was a direct inversion of this, a counter-covenant, an alternative declaration of belonging, pressed not by God onto his people, but by empire onto its subjects. The choice John was describing was not between a future microchip and human freedom. It was the oldest choice in the human story. Whose image do you bear? And to whom does your life belong? Jesus asked this question with a coin in the temple, and he asked it with his life on a Roman cross. The crucifixion was not only a religious event, it was an imperial statement. Crucifixion was Rome's designated punishment for slaves, for rebels, for those who challenged the authority of the system, and the placard nailed above Jesus' head, King of the Jews, was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, the three languages of power and commerce in the ancient Near East, because Rome wanted its message understood by everyone who passed. This man claimed an authority that competed with ours. This is what happens to that claim. And yet, the communities that formed in the aftermath of that execution, in Jerusalem, in Galilee, in Antioch and Corinth and Ephesus, organized themselves around the proclamation that the execution had not ended the claim, that the one who died had been raised, that the empire's ultimate enforcement mechanism, death itself, had been met and had not held. This is why the economic and social pressure described in Revelation carries the weight it carries. John was not writing to people who were simply afraid of losing their businesses. He was writing to people who had already decided, or were trying to decide, whether the resurrection was true enough to stake their livelihoods on. Whether the one who said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's," had, by rising from the dead, answered the question of which authority was ultimate. The mark of the beast was terrifying, not because it was a future technology, but because it was a present reality. The daily demand that you declare, through the ordinary acts of buying and selling and working and belonging, who owned you. And the fear it generated was not paranoid. It was lucid. It was the clear-eyed recognition that the system had teeth, that exclusion was real, that the cost of refusal fell on actual bodies, in actual households, with actual children who needed to eat. What the communities of the first century found, imperfectly, painfully, with enormous cost to many of them, was that the fear of the mark was real, but that it was not the deepest truth. The deepest truth was older and larger, and had been spoken into existence before Rome was founded and would remain after Rome's stones were scattered. That the human person bore an image already, pressed into existence not by empire, but by the one who made the world, and that this image could not be unmarked, could not be cancelled, could not be rendered void by any beast that rose from any sea. Jesus walked through a world saturated with Caesar's image, on coins, on temples, on the lips of tax collectors and the armor of soldiers. And he named, again and again, in parables and healings and meals and confrontations, a different economy. One in which the widow's 2 coins were worth more than the treasury. One in which the excluded and the marked and the indebted and the cast out were the ones the kingdom was coming toward. He did not offer escape from the system. He offered something harder and stranger. The knowledge that the system, for all its apparent totality, did not have the final word on who you were. That has never stopped being true.